Do you think you know the Faroe Islands? You think they are a handful of wet rocks scattered somewhere between Scotland and Iceland, beautiful in photographs you scroll past without stopping, too remote to matter, too small to carry weight. Because that is the only version you have been given. Have you ever wondered why one of the world's oldest parliaments was not born in Athens or Rome or any of the great cities that wrote civilization into marble, but convened on a flat black tongue of volcanic rock by farmers and fishermen who sailed open boats through open water to argue the law more than 12 centuries ago? Also, have you ever considered how a people with no trees, no writing, and no legal right to their own language for 300 unbroken years still managed to preserve their entire medieval literature? Not in books, not in archives, but in the bodies of dancers moving in circles in winter halls, singing the same words their ancestors sang in 1300. Forget the photographs of green cliffs and waterfalls. The Faroe Islands are not the place you were handed. They are 18 islands of ancient fire, sitting on the seam where two oceans argue. A civilization of 55,000 people who built everything they have, not from abundance but from Atlantic wind, fermented meat, and the deliberate decision, renewed in every generation, to hold on to each other. Because here, at 62 degrees north, disappearance has never meant the end. This is Latitude Journal. This is the Faroe Islands. The islands were not always here. 60 million years ago, at the fault line where Greenland was tearing slowly and permanently away from what would become Europe, a volcanic province erupted on a scale the modern world has no comparison for. The North Atlantic Igneous Province poured basalt across an area larger than Western Europe in a geological event so violent that some researchers link it to a mass extinction. The Faroe Islands are what remains when you remove everything except the top 900 meters. 6 kilometers of layered lava, still visible today as the stepped black terraces of every Faroese mountain. Each terrace a distinct eruption, each eruption sassafras eruption from the next by thousands of years of silence during which subtropical forests grew in the pause between the flows and were buried by what came next. The evidence is still there. Drill 3.5 kilometers into the basement rock at Lopra on the southernmost island, and you recover coal seams, fossilized wood, the compressed memory of a tropical world that once existed here before the cold arrived. Then the glaciers came. They carved the U-shaped valleys, the 11-kilometer troughs now called fjords, the amphitheaters of basalt that make every Faroese village feel like something the land cupped deliberately in its hands. When the ice retreated, it left behind 1,117 kilometers of coastline across a landmass of 1,399 square kilometers. More edge than interior. More sea than soil. No point on land is more than 5 kilometers from saltwater. The islands sit between the Norwegian Sea and the North Atlantic Ocean. Their total land area is smaller than the City of London. Their exclusive economic zone is 274,000 square kilometers. A country that is 5% ocean has no realistic choice but to become a maritime civilization. The Faroese understood this before they had language for understanding it. The highest mountain is Slataratindur, the flat summit, 880 meters on the island of Eysturoy. From its plateau, on the clear days that arrive without warning between weeks of horizontal rain, you can see all 18 islands simultaneously. Some Faroese will tell you can see the white smear of Iceland's Vatnajökull Glacier 550 kilometers west. Geographers suspect this is a mirage. But the Faroe Islands have always been a place where the distinction between what is real and what the eye insists on seeing requires careful examination. Survagsvatn is the largest lake in the country. It measures 4 square kilometers. Its surface sits 32 meters above the sea. And every photograph of it shows a lake suspended hundreds of meters in the air, floating above the Atlantic, defying gravity, held up by nothing. The illusion is geometric. Photographed from the cliff of Trelanipa, 142 meters of sheer basalt, whose name translates as Slave Cliff, carrying in that name the memory of a Viking Age practice of executing slaves by throwing them from this edge. The camera collapses the depth between the cliff and the lake's surface into a single plane. The brain, presented with a cliff edge and a water surface behind it, assigns the water to the height of the cliff. It is wrong by 110 meters. The correct response to this is not to feel cheated by the simplicity of the explanation. The correct response is to stand on Trelanipa in November in 40-knot Atlantic wind, with the lake behind you and the ocean below, and understand that here, even the land is unreliable. That surfaces are not what they claim. That seeing is a hypothesis the Faroese have been testing for 12 centuries. Beyond the lake, the road enters a tunnel cut in 2004 through 4 kilometers of solid basalt and emerges into a fold of green land that until that year was one of the most isolated inhabited places in Europe. This is Gossadalur, Goose Valley. Population 11. Before the tunnel, there was no road. There was a mountain pass, rising to approximately 400 meters, and there was a postman who crossed it 3 times a week, in whatever the Atlantic threw at him. He could do it in 45 minutes. Visitors today take 2 hours and feel they have earned something. They have. The old, the sick, the dying in Gossadalur were carried over the same pass. The dead were carried over it for burial in the next valley. And still, in every generation, people looked at what living here required and chose it. Not because they had no alternative. Because the alternative was this. At the seaward edge of the village, a stream falls over a basalt lip 60 meters above the Atlantic. The prevailing wind catches the water before it strikes the sea and turns it sideways into a veil. This is Mulafossur, the waterfall that turns into wind. Behind it, the 722-meter face of Arnarfjall. Above the cliff, a puffin colony in season. Below, the North Atlantic, running green and absolute to the horizon. It is the most photographed view in the country. It is also in October, in rain, with the tunnel that did not exist 20 years ago running up behind you, carrying a car with rental plates toward 11 residents who still choose this, one of the most honest views in the country. The decision to stay in Gossadalur and the waterfall that explains the decision occupy the same 10 square meters of ground. A short distance offshore, basalt towers rise from the Atlantic. The Drangarnir stacks, one of them pierced by a sea arch, large enough to sail a small boat through. Beyond them, the islet of Tindhólmur, raising 5 jagged peaks to which the Faroese gave names that are also a geography lesson. Farthest. Eagle. Small. Broad. Bent. In another country, these would be names assigned by a committee. In the Faroes, they are what the people who could see them decided to call them. Drive north on Streymoy until the road ends at Black Sand and you arrive at Tjernuvik. Look east across the strait between Streymoy and Eysturoy, and 2 basalt towers rise from the sea. Risen 71 meters. Kellingen, 68 meters. The Giant and the Witch. The legend says that the giants of Iceland, envious of the Faroe Islands, sent a giant and a witch to drag them home across the ocean. The giant stood in the water. The witch climbed the mountain Eiðiskolur, 343 meters above the strait, and tied a rope around its summit. You can still see the fissure where the rock split under the strain. They pulled all night and forgot about the sun. As the first light touched them, they turned to stone. The giant still stares west toward Iceland from 71 meters of basalt. The witch stands on 2 thinning legs that geologists estimate will be toppled by a winter storm within this century. A crew filming here now may be filming the last generation to see the legend intact. The story does not require interpretation. In the Faroe Islands, the landscape is the legend. every rock has a name. Every name is a story. Every story is about the same things: hubris, weather, and time. 20 minutes south of Tórshavn, where Streymoy narrows to face the smaller islands of Hester and Kolter across a sound that runs cold and fast with tide, stands a low black-tarred wooden building with red-painted windows and a turf roof. This is Røykstaven, the smoke room. The oldest part of its structure dates to the 11th century. The Pettersen family has lived here in unbroken succession since 1557. The current resident is the 17th generation. There are no trees in the Faroe Islands. There have never been trees in any number that would supply timber. The pine logs that form the walls of Røykstaven are said to have drifted ashore from Norway, already numbered for assembly, as though the sea had decided this house should stand here. 20 paces from the front door, the unfinished walls of the Magnus Cathedral stand roofless against a sky they have faced for 700 years. Bishop Erlendur began building it in the 1300s. He never finished it. In 1349 and 1350, the Black Death reached the Faroe Islands and reduced the population to roughly 1/3 of its previous number. Some historians link the abandoned cathedral to the catastrophe. Others to a tax revolt. The walls do not specify. They simply stand, 7 centuries of open sky above them, sheep grazing in the nave. Beside the ruins, St. Olav's Church, built around 1250, the oldest church in continuous use in the country, has a small closed-off hole in its northern wall. This is the Holer, the medieval opening through which lepers could listen to the Mass without entering the building. Kirkjubøur encodes an entire social history in a patch of ground smaller than a city block. The oldest inhabited wooden house in the world. An unfinished cathedral. An exclusion hole in a church wall. And the 17th generation of the same family, farming the same ground the medieval bishops once controlled. In the Faroe Islands, the past is not a period. It is a neighbor. Tórshavn, Thor's Harbor. Population 4,223. The smallest capital city in Europe. The entire country of 54,870 people would not fill a mid-sized stadium. At the heart of the city, the Tinganes Peninsula, Parliament Point divides the harbor into 2 coves on a tongue of flat, black, volcanic rock so low to the water that a strong east wind brings spray across the Parliament buildings. According to tradition preserved in the Færøinga saga, Norse settlers convened the first General Assembly here around 825 AD. The lugting, the law thing, the thing of law, that emerged from those first meetings claims a continuous lineage to that moment. More than 12 centuries on the same rocks. The Danish state abolished the lugting in 1816. It was re-established in 1852. Granted legislative powers in 1948. Its protocols were written in Danish until 1927, when Faroese was finally permitted. Today, the Prime Minister of the Faroe Islands, the lugmother, the lawman, works in a 17th century building 30 meters from the rocks where free farmers argued the law before the Viking Age was over. The most remote capital in Europe is also one of the oldest. The smallest is also, by consistent measure, one of the safest. In Tórshavn, doors are left unlocked. Children walk home from school alone. In June, at the solstice, you can sit on the parliamentary jetty at midnight in a silver-gray luminescence the Faroese call Natarsol, the night sun, the sun that has technically set but has not agreed to leave, and feel almost nothing but the wind. In December, the same city sees fewer than 6 hours of weak daylight. Every window holds candles. The Faroese have calibrated their interior life to the exact rhythm of the light because for 12 centuries they had no alternative to that calibration. And now that they do, many of them choose it anyway. On the island of Suðuroy, in the small village of Famjen, inside a plain whitewashed church that receives perhaps 10 worshippers on an ordinary Sunday, hangs a piece of cloth that changed the country. In 1919, 3 Faroese students in Copenhagen, Jens Oliver Lisberg, Jonas Assursson, and Pauli Dahl, sewed a flag. A Nordic cross. Red outlined in blue on a white field. The white of Atlantic foam and open sky. The red and blue of Faroese folk costume, the flags of Iceland and Norway, a shared Norse inheritance made distinct. They named it Merkið. The banner. The mark. On the 22nd of June 1919, Lisberg returned home to Famjen for a wedding and raised it on Faroese soil for the first time. The Danish authorities refused to recognize it. For 20 years, the raising of Merkið was an act of political resistance. In 1930, the Danish Prime Minister ordered it removed from a ceremony marking the 1000th anniversary of the Icelandic Parliament. Faroese demonstrators removed the Danish flag in response. Arrests followed. Fines followed. Then came the war. On the 9th of April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark. 3 days later, 2 Royal Navy destroyers entered Tórshavn harbor. Operation Valentine. the friendliest invasion in modern history. The Royal Navy could not allow Faroese fishing vessels that were at that moment running Atlantic fish through mined waters to keep two countries fed to sail under the flag of a German-occupied nation. The Faroese demanded Merkith. The Danish governor objected. The British consul briefly considered ordering them to sail under an invented green and white flag instead. After demonstrations in Tórshavn, on the 25th of April 1940, the British government recognized Merkith as the civil ensign of the Faroe Islands. The BBC announced it in every major language in the world. From a village wedding on Suðuroy in 1919 to the BBC World Service in 1940. 21 years. The original Merkith still hangs at Falmien, faded and behind glass. The 25th of April is still Flag Day. There are parades. There is brass music. And in a small church on the southernmost island, the cloth that a student sewed in a Copenhagen apartment hangs in the place where sacred things are kept. This was not sentiment. It was a decision made by three young men who understood that a people without a flag can be told they do not exist. The Faroese language, Faroisk, is the closest living relative of Icelandic. Both descend from Old West Norse, the language of the Viking Age settlers, and both preserve grammatical structures, vowel systems, and case inflections that mainland Scandinavia abandoned centuries ago. Faroese has approximately 70,000 native speakers. It was banned from church, from law, from every official document after the Lutheran Reformation of 1538. Danish replaced it. The suppression lasted 300 years. A language spoken by farmers and fishermen in a country of perhaps 4,000 people on islands that most of Europe had forgotten existed, survived not in texts but in the mouth. The man who first gave it a formal written form was a Lutheran pastor named Wenceslaus Ulricus Hammersheim, working in 1846 with the Icelandic scholar Jón Sigurdsson. His orthography deliberately preserved the Old Norse roots. Consonants no longer pronounced, inflections no longer spoken. To read Faroese on the page is to see the 12th century. To hear it in the mouth is to hear a language that has moved on without informing the writing system. The gap between the written and the spoken form is not an error. It is a national archive. But what kept the language alive before Hammersheim gave it letters was not a text. It was the chain dance. The Forisker dancer. In a circle. Hands held. The right hand laid over the left of the person beside you. 2 paces left. One step back. The song leader sings the verses. The circle answers with the chorus. No instruments. No accompaniment. Only the human voice and the rhythmic stamp of feet on a wooden floor in a winter hall where warmth came from pressed bodies because there was no other warmth. The ballads the dance carries, the kvæði, are long beyond expectation. The 8 surviving versions of the Sigurd cycle alone run between 400 and 670 stanzas each. The complete published corpus, gathered across 60 years of scholarly collection between 1941 and 2003, contains roughly 44,000 stanzas. 44,000 stanzas. Preserved not in any library, but in the bodies of farmers. In breath. In the grip of one hand on the hand of another. For 7 centuries, between the medieval composition of the oldest ballads and Hammershaim's first transcriptions in the late 1700s, the entire heroic literature of the country was carried not on paper, but in the floor. The chain dance is in decline now. In the 1980s, an estimated 2,500 people danced regularly. By 2019, that number had fallen to 350 at the triennial national dancing events. Apps exist. School programs teach the steps. The corpus is digitized and cataloged and preserved. But the technology of the body is not the same as the technology of the archive. A database of 44,000 stanzas does not carry the weight of 7 centuries in the grip of a hand. To reach Vikings, the westernmost island in the country, you take a helicopter in bad weather or a small ferry in good. Both options assume weather has an opinion. The island is roughly 10 square kilometers. Its year-round population is perhaps 10 people. At its peak in 1940, it was 170. Between late April and August, an estimated 125,000 pairs of Atlantic puffins nest in burrows along its clifftop grass. The island also supports 23,000 pairs of kittiwakes, 50,000 pairs of fulmars, 50,000 pairs of storm petrels, and on the offshore islet of Mykinne-Skjolmur, the only northern gannet colony in the country, nesting on a rock bridge above an 80-meter drop to the sea below. The ratio of humans to puffins on Vikings is approximately 12,500 to 1. The island also harbors a relict subspecies of house mouse, Mus musculus mykinesiensis, whose closest relative was the St. Kilda mouse, now extinct. Genetic analysis places its arrival at approximately 500 AD. The Vikings mouse arrived with the Irish monks. It has outlasted the monks, the Norse, the bishops, the Danish monopoly, the banking collapse, and the population peak of 1940. In a country that measures its history in centuries, the mouse is the longest continuous resident on the oldest settled island. Every autumn, when the puffins leave and the Atlantic storms begin to build from the southwest, when the helicopter service becomes intermittent and the ferry stops running, Vikings asks its remaining 10 people the same question it has asked every generation. Is this still worth it? Every year so far, 10 people have said yes. On the northwest coast of Strimoy, the road ends at Saksun, a circular valley. A tidal lagoon that was once a natural harbor open to the Atlantic, until sometime in the 17th century a single heavy storm dragged so much sand into the inlet that it sealed shut. The boats stopped coming. The harbor became a lagoon. The Atlantic floods back in twice a day and twice a day retreats, as though still deciding whether to reopen the connection. 11 people live here now. The turf-roofed church, Saksuner Kirche, built in 1858, was not built here. It was built in the village of Chernuvik, on the other side of the mountain, disassembled, and carried over the pass on the backs of the villagers who needed it on this side. Faroese churches sometimes travel. Faroese people carry what they need over the mountain to wherever they have decided to stay. 60 kilometers north on the island of Eysturoy, at the end of its own separate road, the village of Joguv, Gorge, occupies a position beside a 200-meter sea-filled cleft in the basalt that served as a natural harbor for centuries. Fishing boats were hauled up a cliff ramp on a hand-cranked winch above the surf. At its peak in 1950, Jogv had 210 inhabitants. Now it has approximately 19. Its church, built in 1929, was the first in the Faroe Islands to hold services in Faroese rather than Danish. A small congregation in a remote gorge made the first official claim that God might understand Faroese. The country agreed, eventually. In the Faroe Islands, the villages that are emptying have not been abandoned. They are being held open by ownership and memory, and the occasional roof repaired by someone who left but could not sell the house their grandparents built. This is not the same as thriving. It is something harder to name, and more specifically Faroese. No subject divides the Faroese from the outside world more completely than the Grindadrap. When a pod of long-finned pilot whales is sighted close to shore, a Grindabod, boats converge, surround the pod, and drive it into one of 23 designated bays. On the beach, men kill the whales with a regulated spinal lance designed to sever the spinal cord and major arteries within seconds. The meat and blubber, twust og spik, are distributed without charge among participants and the community, according to rules first written in 1298 in the same sheep letter that established the country's foundational agricultural law. The practice is documented continuously since 1584. Whale bones in Faroese middens date to approximately 1200 AD. The average annual catch since the year 2000 is 670 pilot whales. In September 2021, a single drive killed 1,423 Atlantic white-sided dolphins. Far more than anyone could use. The community knew something had gone wrong. The government imposed an annual dolphin cap of 500 in 2022. In 2025, Faroese police filed the first ever animal abuse charges against Grindadrap participants over a 2024 hunt in which 90 surviving pilot whales were held in shallow water for 27 hours. The Faroese argument is consistent. Communal, non-commercial, centuries of documented subsistence necessity, regulated for minimum suffering, no quota required because the population is stable and the distribution is free. The counter-argument is also consistent. Entire family pods, pregnant females, calves. And since 2008, the Faroese health authorities own advisory warning pregnant women and children against eating the meat. Since 2012, the formal recommendation of the country's own medical researchers that pilot whale meat should no longer be consumed by anyone, given mercury and PCB levels that now exceed every safety threshold. A documentary cannot resolve this. What it can show is simpler. Many young Faroese now decline the meat for health reasons while defending the practice on cultural ones. A tradition that survived the Black Death and 3 centuries of Danish suppression is now being negotiated from within by the same people it belongs to. That is what cultural survival actually looks like when the world does not stay the same. It is not clean. In October 1992, the Faroe Islands became a precise lesson in what happens when a maritime economy borrows on the assumptions that the sea will always provide. Through the 1980s, the islands boomed on cheap credit. Fish prices were high. Banks lent without reserve. Public debt reached DKK 4 billion. Then fish prices collapsed. Quotas were cut. On Saturday, 3 October 1992, the Danish Financial Supervisory Authority told the Faroese National Bank it needed to raise DKK 500 million by Monday morning. It could not. GDP contracted by roughly 40%. Unemployment peaked at 26% in January 1994. Between 1989 and 1995, approximately 10 to 15% of the entire population left. Most to Denmark. Some to Norway. Some to wherever they could go. Whole villages, already thinning, emptied faster. the independence movement, which had been building towards something that felt briefly unstoppable, dissolved overnight. A country that cannot survive without a bailout cannot credibly argue it no longer needs the country writing the check. Recovery came, as it always has. Fish returned. Salmon aquaculture built a second economy. GDP grew at roughly 4% annually through the late 90s and 2000s. The sovereign debt was eliminated. By 2008, the Faroes were wealthy enough to extend a $52 million loan to Iceland during that country's banking collapse. The Danish block grant now funds approximately 9% of the national budget, down from 29% in 2000. Fish and fish products, principally salmon, account for 90 to 95% of all goods exports. The independence question that a 1946 referendum answered with 74% in favor, a margin of 166 votes that Denmark promptly annulled, is still on the table. The table is still in Tórshavn, on the same rocks where the Lugting met in 825 AD and argued the law. Some questions do not resolve. They simply continue, generation after generation, with the same margin, the same patience, and the same refusal to accept that the answer is final. On the 19th December 2020, the Faroe Islands opened the world's first undersea roundabout. The Eysturoyartunnelin 11. 24 kilometers of tunnel connecting the capital on Streymoy to the island of Eysturoy reaches a depth of 189 meters below the sea at its deepest point, before rising to a junction chamber 72. 6 meters below the surface of Skálafjörður Fjord. At that junction, underground, beneath the fjord, there is a roundabout. And around the roundabout, an 80-meter steel sculpture by the Faroese artist Tróndur Patterson. Figures rendered in full human scale, standing in a ring, holding hands, facing inward toward a central column of light. The figures are walking from darkness into the light, Patterson said. They symbolize the very Faroese idea that by joining hands and working together, we achieve great things. The figures are holding hands in a circle. 2 paces left. 1 step back. The chain dance, cast in steel 72. 6 meters below the sea. The same gesture that carried 44,000 stanzas through 3 centuries without paper. The same circle that held a language alive when the law forbade writing it. The same held hands that hauled boats up a cliff face in a gorge, carried a church over a mountain pass, and sailed a fishing fleet through mined Atlantic waters to keep 2 countries fed. Encoded now in steel. Submerged. Lit. permanent. A civilization that preserved everything in the grip of one hand on another, eventually pressed that grip into the hardest material it had and placed it at the deepest point of the deepest tunnel it had ever dug. The Faroe Islands should not exist the way they do. Not by the logic of scale, not by the logic of resources, not by any modern measure of what a civilization requires to sustain itself across 12 centuries on a volcanic archipelago ringed by the North Atlantic, stripped of its own language for 300 years, periodically devastated by plague, by storms that dismantled everything built against them, and by a banking system that collapsed over a single weekend and took a quarter of the population with it, across the water and into someone else's city. What has persisted here is not the result of protection or favorable geography, or the patronage of powerful neighbors who wanted this place to survive. It is something quieter and more specific, the collective decision, renewed in every generation, to hold the circle. To stand in the winter hall and link hands with the person beside you, and sing the old words even when the words are in a language you are not legally permitted to write. To carry the church over the mountain. To stay in the village of 11. To raise the flag at a wedding 21 years, before a government will agree to see it. As the world's small places are pulled between mass tourism and mass emigration, between the connectivity they need to survive and the visibility that threatens to unmake them, between the economy of fish and the politics of fish, between the subsidy that arrives from Copenhagen and the independence that does not yet, the places that built their wisdom from isolation rather than access, from scarcity rather than surplus, from the necessity of standing in a circle in the cold and holding on, those places begin to feel less like exceptions to the modern story and more like its earliest chapters. The Faroe Islands are one of those places. They are not the only one.